privilege as a political body. You're willing to deal out the Article 3 courts because you hate Trump that much. What you've done is you've weakened the institution of the presidency. And be careful what you wish for, because it's going to come back your way. So abuse of Congress should be entitled Abuse of Power by the Congress. If you think Adam Schiff is trying to get to the truth, I got a bridge I want to sell you. These people hate Trump's guts. They rammed it through the House in a way you couldn't get a parking ticket, and they achieved their goal of impeaching him before the election. Well, the Senate's going to achieve its goal of acquitting him in February. And the American people are going to get to decide in November who they want to be their president. So acquittal will happen in about 2 hours. Exoneration comes when President Trump gets reelected, because the people of the United States are fed up with this crap. But the damage you have done will be long-lasting. Abuse of power. You're impeaching the President of the United States for suspending foreign aid for a short period of time that they eventually received ahead of schedule to leverage an investigation that never happened. You're going to remove the President of the United States for suspending foreign aid to leverage an investigation of a political opponent that never occurred. The Ukrainians did not know the suspension until September. They didn't feel any pressure. And if you're okay with Joe Biden and Hunter Biden doing what they did, it says more about you than it does anything else. The point of the abuse of power article is that you've made it almost impossible now for any president to pick up the phone if all of us can assume the worst and impeach somebody based on a subjective standard. He was talking about corruption in the Ukraine with a past president. And the Biden's conduct in the Ukraine undercut our ability to effectively deal with corruption by allowing his son to receive $3 million from the most corrupt gas company in the Ukraine. Can you imagine how the Ukrainian parliament must have felt to be lectured by Joe Biden about ending sweetheart deals? What you have done is impeach the President of the United States and willing to remove him because he suspended foreign aid for 40 days to leverage an investigation that never occurred. And to my good friend Dick Durbin, Donald Trump has done more to help the Ukrainian people than Barack Obama did in his entire 8 years. If you're looking for somebody to help the Ukrainian people fight the Russians, how about giving them some weapons? This is a sham. This is a farce. This is disgusting. This is an injustice to President Trump as a person. It's a threat to the office. It will end soon. It's going to be an overwhelming rejection of both articles. We're going to pick up the pieces and try to go forward. But I can say this without any hesitation. I worry about the future of the presidency after what's happened here. Ladies and gentlemen, you will come to regret this whole process. And to those who have these pens, I hope you will understand history will judge those pens as a souvenir of shame. I yield.
Mr. President.
The Democratic leader.
The articles of impeachment before us charged President Donald John Trump with offenses against the Constitution and the American people. The first article of impeachment charges that President Trump abused the office of the presidency by soliciting the interference of a foreign power, Ukraine, to benefit himself in the 2020 election. The president asked a foreign leader to do us a favor, us meaning him, and investigate his political opponents. In order to elicit these political investigations, President Trump withheld a White House meeting and hundreds of millions of dollars in military assistance from an ally at war with Russia. There's extensive documentation in the record proving this quid pro quo and the corrupt motive behind it. The facts are not seriously in dispute. In fact, several Republican senators admitted they believe the president committed this offense with varying degrees of opprobrium: inappropriate, wrong, shameful. Almost all Republicans will argue, however, that this reprehensible conduct does not rise to the level of an impeachable offense. The founders could not have been clearer. William Davey, a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, deemed impeachment, quote, an essential security, lest the president, quote, spare no efforts or means whatever to get himself reelected. James Madison offered a specific list of impeachable offenses during the debate in Independence Hall. A president might lose his capacity or embezzle public funds. A despicable soul might succumb to bribes while in office. Madison then arrived at what he believed was the worst conduct a president could engage in. The president could betray his trust to foreign powers, which would be fatal to the Republic. Madison's words. When I studied the Constitution and the Federalist Papers in high school, admittedly, I was skeptical of George Washington's warning that, quote, foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government, unquote. It seemed so far-fetched. Who would dare? But the foresight and wisdom of the founders endures. Madison was right. Washington was right. There is no greater subversion of our democracy than for powers outside of our borders to determine elections within them. If Americans believe that they don't determine their senator, their governor, their president, but rather some foreign potentate does, that's the beginning of the end of democracy. For a foreign country to attempt such a thing on its own is contemptible. For an American president to deliberately solicit such a thing, to blackmail a foreign country into helping him win an election, is unforgivable. Now, does this rise to the level of impeachable offense? Of course it does. Of course it does. The term high crimes derives from English law. Crimes were committed between subjects of the monarchy. High crimes were committed against the crown itself. The framers did not design a monarchy. They designed a democracy, a nation where the people were king. High crimes are those committed against the entire people of the United States. The president sought to cheat the people out of a free and fair election. How could such an offense not be deemed a high crime, a crime against the people? As one constitutional scholar in the House Judiciary hearings testified, if this is not impeachable, nothing is. I agree. I judge that President Trump is guilty of the first article of impeachment. The second article of impeachment is equally straightforward. Once the president realized he got caught, he tried to cover it up. The president asserted blanket immunity. He categorically defied congressional subpoenas, ordered his aides not to testify, and withheld the production of relevant documents. Even President Nixon, author of the most infamous presidential cover-up in history, permitted his aides to testify in Congress in the Watergate investigation. The idea that the Trump administration was properly invoking the various rights and privileges of the presidency is nonsense. At each stage of the House inquiry, the administration conjured up a different bad faith justification for evading accountability. There is no circumstance under which the administration would have complied. When I asked the president's counsel twice to name one document or one witness the president provided to Congress, they could not answer. It cannot be that the president, by dint of legal shamelessness, can escape scrutiny entirely. Once again, the facts are not in dispute, but some have sought to portray the second article of impeachment as somehow less important than the first. It is not. The second article of impeachment is necessary if Congress is to ever hold a president accountable again, Democrat or Republican. The consequences of sanctioning such categorical obstruction of Congress would be far-reaching, and they will be irreparable. I judge that President Trump is guilty of the second article of impeachment. The Senate should convict President Trump, remove him from the presidency, and disqualify him from holding future office. The guilt of the president on these charges is so obvious that here again, several Republican senators admit that the House has proved its case. So instead of maintaining the president's innocence, the president's counsel ultimately told the Senate that even if the president did what he was accused of, it's not impeachable. This has taken the form of an escalating series of Dershowitzian arguments, including, quote, abuse of power is not an impeachable offense. Quote, the president can't be impeached for non-criminal conduct, but he also can't be indicted for criminal conduct. Quote, if a president believes his own re-election is essential to the nation, then a quid pro quo is not corrupt. These are the excuses of a child caught in a lie, each explanation more outlandish and desperate than the last. It would be laughable if not for the fact that the cumulative effect of these arguments would render not just this president, but all presidents immune from impeachment and therefore above the law. Now, several members of this chamber said that even if the president is guilty, and even if it's impeachable, the Senate still shouldn't convict the president because there's an election coming up. As if the framers forgot about elections when they wrote the impeachment clause. If the founders believed that even when a president is guilty of an impeachable offense, that the next election should decide his fate, they never would have included an impeachment clause in the Constitution. That much is obvious. Alone, each of the defenses advanced by the President's counsel comes close to being preposterous. Together, they are as dangerous to the Republic as this president, a fig leaf so large as to excuse any presidential misconduct. Unable to defend the president, arguments were found to make him a king. Let future generations know that only a fraction of the Senate swallowed these fantasies. The rest of us condemn them to the ash heap of history and the derision of first-year law students everywhere. We are only the third Senate in history to sit as a court of impeachment for the president. The task we were given was not easy, but the framers gave the Senate this responsibility because they could not imagine any other body capable of it. They considered others, but they entrusted us to us, and the Senate failed. The Republican caucus trained its outrage not on the conduct of the president, but on the impeachment process in the House, deriding falsely an alleged lack of fairness and thoroughness. The conjured outrage was so blinding that the Republican majority ended up guilty of the very sins it falsely accused the House of committing. It conducted the least fair, least thorough, most rushed impeachment trial in the history of this country. A simple majority of senators denied the Senate's right to examine relevant evidence, to call witnesses, to review documents, and to properly try the impeachment of the president, making this the first impeachment trial in history that heard from no witnesses. A simple majority of senators, in deference to, and most likely in fear of, the president of their party, perpetrated a great miscarriage of justice in the trial of President Trump. As a result, the verdict of this kangaroo court will be meaningless. By refusing the facts, by refusing witnesses and documents, the Republican majority has placed a giant asterisk, the asterisk of a sham trial, next to the acquittal of President Trump, written in permanent ink. Acquittal in an unfair trial with this giant asterisk, the asterisk of a sham trial, is worth nothing at all to President Trump or to anybody else. No doubt, the president will boast he received total exoneration, but we know better. We know this wasn't a trial by any stretch of the definition, and the American people know it too. We've heard a lot about the framers over the past several weeks, about the impeachment clause they forged, the separation of powers they wrought, the conduct they most feared in our chief magistrate. But there is something the founders considered even more fundamental to our republic: truth. The founders had seen and studied societies governed by the iron fist of tyrants and the divine right of kings, but none by argument, rational thinking, facts, debate. Hamilton said the American people would determine, quote, whether societies are really capable of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or forever destined to depend on accident and force. And what an astonishing thing the founders did. They placed a bet with long odds. They believed that reflection and choice would make us capable of self-government, that we wouldn't agree on everything, but at least we could agree on a common baseline of fact and of truth. They wrote a constitution with the remarkable idea that even the most powerful person in our country was not above the law and could be put on trial, a place where you seek truth. The faith our founders placed in us makes the failure of this Senate even more damning. Our nation was founded on the idea of truth, but there was no truth here. The Republican majority couldn't let truth into this trial. The Republican majority refused to get the evidence because they were afraid of what it might show. Our nation was founded on the idea of truth, but in order to countenance this president, you have to ignore the truth. Republicans walk through the halls with their heads down. They didn't see the tweet. They can't respond to everything he says. They hope he learned his lesson this time. Yes, maybe this time he learned his lesson. Our nation was founded on truth. But in order to excuse this president, you have to willfully ignore the truth and indulge in the president's conspiracy theories. Millions of people voted illegally. The deep state is out to get them. Ukraine interfered in our elections. You must attempt to normalize his behavior. Obama did it too, they falsely claim. Democrats are just as bad. Our nation was founded on the idea of truth. But this president is such a menace, so contemptuous of every virtue, so dishonorable, so dishonest, that you must ignore, indeed sacrifice, the truth to maintain his favor. The trial of this president, its failure, reflects the central challenge of this presidency and maybe the central challenge of this time in our democracy. You cannot be on the side of this president and be on the side of truth. And if we are to survive as a nation, we must choose truth. Because if the truth doesn't matter, if the news you don't like is fake, if cheating in an election is acceptable, if everyone is as wicked as the wickedest among us, then the hope for the future is lost. The eyes of the nation are upon this Senate, and what they see will strike doubt in the heart of even the most ardent patriot. The House managers established the president abused the great power of his office to try to cheat in an election, and the Senate majority is poised to look the other way. So I direct my final message, not to the House managers, not even to my fellow senators, but to the American people. My message is simple. Don't lose hope. There is justice in this world, and truth, and right. I believe that. I wouldn't be in this government if I didn't. Somehow, in ways we can't predict, with God's mysterious hand guiding us, truth and right will prevail. There have been dark periods in our history, but we always overcome. The Senate's opening prayer yesterday was Amos 5:24. Let justice roll down like water, righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. The long arc of the moral universe, my fellow Americans, does bend towards justice. America does change for the better, but not on its own. It took millions of Americans hundreds of years to make this country what it is today. Americans of every age and color and creed who marched and protested, who stood up and sat in. Americans who defended this democracy, this beautiful democracy, in its darkest hours. On Memorial Day in 1884, Oliver Wendell Holmes told his war-weary audience that, quote, whether one accepts from fortune her spade and will look downward and dig, or from aspiration her axe and cord and will scale the ice, the one and only success which is yours to command is to bring to your work a mighty heart. I have confidence that Americans of a different generation, our generation, will bring to our work a mighty heart to fight for what's right, to fight for the truth, and never, never lose faith. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
The United States Senate was made for moments like this. The framers predicted that factional fever might dominate House majorities from time to time. They knew the country would need a firewall to keep partisan flames from scorching our republic. So they created the Senate. Out of necessity, James Madison wrote, of some stable institution in the government. Of some stable institution in the government. Today, we will fulfill this founding purpose. We will reject this incoherent case that comes nowhere near justifying the first presidential removal in history. This partisan impeachment will end today. But I fear the threat to our institutions may not, because this episode is one of a symptom of something much deeper. In the last 3 years, the opposition to this president has come to revolve around a truly dangerous concept. Leaders in the opposite party increasingly argue that if our institutions don't produce the outcomes they like, our institutions themselves must be broken. One side has decided that defeat simply means the whole system is broken, that we literally tear up the rules and write new ones. Normally, when a party loses an election, it accepts defeat. It reflects and retools. But not this time. Within months, Secretary Clinton was suggesting her defeat was invalid. She called our president illegitimate. Former president falsely claimed that President Trump didn't actually win. He lost the election, the former president said. And members of Congress have used similar rhetoric. a disinformation campaign, weakening confidence in our democracy. The very real issue of foreign election interference was abused to fuel conspiracy theories. For years, prominent voices said it had been a secret conspiracy between the president's campaign and a foreign government. But when the Mueller investigation and the Senate Intelligence Committee debunked that, the delegitimizing endeavor didn't stop. Didn't stop. Remember what Chairman Schiff said here on the floor. He suggested that if the American people re-elect President Trump in November, that election will be presumptively invalid as well. That's Chairman Schiff on this floor, saying if the American people re-elect President Trump this November, that election will be presumptively invalid as well. So they still don't accept the American voters' last decision. And now they're preparing to reject the voters' next decision if they don't like the outcome. Not only the last decision, but the next decision. Heads, we win. Tails, you cheated. And who can trust our democracy anyway, they say. This kind of talk creates more fear and division than our foreign adversaries could achieve in their wildest dreams. As Dr. Hill testified, our adversaries seek to divide us against each other, degrade our institutions, and destroy the faith of the American people in our democracy. And as she noted, if Americans become consumed by partisan rancor, we can easily do that work for them. The architects of this impeachment claimed they were defending norms and traditions. In reality, it was an assault on both. First, the House attacked its own precedents on fairness and due process, and by rushing to use the impeachment power as a political weapon of first resort. Then their articles attacked the office of the presidency. Then they attacked the Senate and called us treacherous. Then the far left tried to impugn the Chief Justice for remaining neutral during the trial. And now, for the final act, the Speaker of the House is trying to steal the Senate's sole power to render a verdict. The Speaker says she will just refuse to accept this acquittal. Speaker of the House says she refuses to accept this acquittal. Whatever that means. Perhaps she will tear up the verdict like she tore up the State of the Union address. So I would ask my distinguished colleagues across the aisle, is this really where you want to go? The president isn't the president. An acquittal isn't an acquittal. Attack institutions until they get their way. Even my colleagues who may not agree with this president must see the insanity of this logic. It's like saying you're so worried about a bull in a china shop that you want to bulldoze the china shop to chase it out. And here's the most troubling part. The most troubling part. There is no sign this attack on our institutions will end here. In recent months, Democratic presidential candidates and Senate leaders have toyed with killing a filibuster so the Senate could approve radical changes with less deliberation and less persuasion. Several of our colleagues sent an extraordinary brief to the Supreme Court threatening political retribution if the justices did not decide a case the way they wanted. We've seen proposals to turn the FEC, the regulator of elections and political speech, into a partisan body for the first time ever. All these things, Mr. President, all these things, a toxic temptation to stop debating policy within our great American governing traditions and instead declare a war on the traditions themselves. A war on the traditions themselves. So, colleagues, whatever policy differences we may have, we should all agree this is precisely the kind of recklessness the Senate was created to stop. The response to losing one election cannot be to attack the office of the presidency. The response to losing several elections cannot be to threaten the Electoral College. The response to losing a court case cannot be to threaten the judiciary. The response to losing a vote cannot be to threaten the Senate. We simply cannot let factional fever break our institutions. It must work the other way, as Madison and Hamilton intended. The institutions must break the fever, rather than the other way around. The framers built the Senate to keep temporary rage from doing permanent damage to our republic. The framers built the Senate to keep temporary rage from doing permanent damage to our republic. That, Mr. President, is what we will do when we end this precedent-breaking impeachment. I hope we will look back on this vote and say, this was the day the fever began to break. I hope we will not say, this was just the beginning. I ask unanimous consent the Senate stand in recess subject to the call of the chair.
Without objection, the Senate stands in recess subject to the call of the chair.
The Senate will convene as a court of impeachment. If there's no objection, the journal of proceedings of the trial are approved to date. The Deputy Sergeant at Arms will make the proclamation.
Hear ye, hear ye. All persons are commanded to keep silence on pain of imprisonment while the Senate of the United States is sitting for the trial of the Articles of Impeachment exhibited by the House of Representatives against Donald John Trump, President of the United States. As a reminder to everyone in the chamber, as well as those in the galleries, demonstrations of approval or disapproval are prohibited.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, the Senate is now ready to vote on the Articles of Impeachment, and after that is done, we will adjourn the Court of Impeachment.
The clerk will now read the first article of impeachment.
Article 1, Abuse of Power. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives, quote, shall have the sole power of impeachment, unquote, and that the President, quote, shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, close quote. In his conduct of the office of President of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States, and, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in that, using the powers of his office, President Trump solicited the interference of a foreign government, Ukraine, in the 2020 United States presidential election. He did so through a scheme or course of conduct that included soliciting the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations that would benefit his re-election, harm the election prospects of a political opponent, and influence the 2020 United States presidential election to his advantage. President Trump also sought to pressure the government of Ukraine to take these steps by conditioning official United States government acts of significant value to Ukraine on its public announcement of the investigations. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct for corrupt purposes in pursuit of personal political benefit. In doing so, President Trump used the powers of the presidency in a manner that compromised the national security of the United States and undermined the integrity of the United States democratic process. He thus ignored and injured the interests of the nation. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct through the following means. 1. President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within and outside the United States government, corruptly solicited the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations into A, political opponent, former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., and B, a discredited theory promoted by Russia alleging that Ukraine, rather than Russia, interfered in the 2016 United States presidential election. 2, with the same corrupt motives, President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within the outside of the United States government, conditioned 2 official acts on the public announcements that he had requested. A, the release of $391 million of United States taxpayer funds that Congress had appropriated on a bipartisan basis for the purpose of providing vital military and security assistance to Ukraine to oppose Russian aggression, and which President Trump had ordered suspended. And B, a head of state meeting at the White House, which the President of Ukraine sought to demonstrate continued United States support for the government of Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. 3, faced with the public revelation of his actions, President Trump ultimately released the military and security assistance to the government of Ukraine and has persisted in openly and corruptly urging and soliciting Ukraine to undertake investigations for his personal political benefit. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous invitations of foreign interference in United States elections. In all of this, President Trump abused the powers of the presidency by ignoring and injuring national security and other vital national interests to obtain an improper personal political benefit. He has also betrayed the nation by abusing his high office to enlist a foreign power in corrupting democratic elections. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to national security and the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
Each senator, when his or her name is called, will stand in his or her place and vote guilty or not guilty as required by Rule 23 of the Senate Rules on Impeachment. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution, regarding the vote required for conviction on impeachment, provides that no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. The question is on the first article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent, Donald John Trump, guilty or not guilty? A roll call vote is required. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Not guilty. Mr. Alexander, not guilty. Ms. Baldwin. Guilty. Ms. Baldwin, guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Not guilty. Mr. Barrasso, not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Guilty. Mr. Bennett, guilty. Mrs. Blackburn. Not guilty. Mrs. Blackburn, not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. Guilty. Mr. Blumenthal, guilty. Mr. Blunt. Not guilty. Mr. Blunt, not guilty. Mr. Booker. Guilty. Mr. Booker, guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Not guilty. Mr. Bozeman, not guilty. Mr. Braun. Not guilty. Mr. Braun, not guilty. Mr. Brown. Guilty. Mr. Brown, guilty. Mr. Burr. Not guilty. Mr. Burr, not guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Guilty. Ms. Cantwell, guilty. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, guilty. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, guilty. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, not guilty. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, not guilty. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, guilty. Mr. Cotton. Not guilty. Mr. Cotton, not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Not guilty. Mr. Kramer, not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, not guilty. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, guilty. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, guilty. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, not guilty. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, not guilty. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, guilty. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, not guilty. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, not guilty. Ms. Harris. Ms. Harris, guilty. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, guilty. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, guilty. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, guilty. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Hyde-Smith, not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, not guilty. Mr. Johnson.
Not guilty.
Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Jones.
Guilty.
Mr. Jones, guilty. Mr. Kane.
Guilty.
Mr. Kane, guilty. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. King. Mr. King, guilty. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, guilty. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, not guilty. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, guilty. Mr. Lee. Not guilty. Mr. Lee, not guilty. Mrs. Loeffler. Mrs. Loeffler, not guilty. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, guilty. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, guilty. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, not guilty. Ms. McSally. Ms. McSally, not guilty. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, guilty. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, guilty. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, not guilty. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, not guilty. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, guilty. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, guilty. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, not guilty. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Perdue, not guilty. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, guilty. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, guilty. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, not guilty. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney, guilty. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, guilty. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, not guilty. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, not guilty. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, guilty. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, not guilty. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, guilty. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, guilty. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, not guilty. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall, guilty. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, guilty. Ms. Warren. Guilty. Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, not guilty.
On this article of impeachment, 48 senators have pronounced Donald John Trump, President of the United States, guilty as charged. 52 senators have pronounced him not guilty as charged. 2/3 of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that the respondent, Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the first article of impeachment. The clerk will read the second article of impeachment.
Article 2, Obstruction of Congress. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment and that the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. In his conduct of the office of the President of the United States and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States and, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has directed the unprecedented, categorical, and indiscriminate defiance of subpoenas issued by the House of Representatives pursuant to its sole power of impeachment. President Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in a manner offensive to and subversive of the Constitution, in that the House of Representatives has engaged in an impeachment inquiry focused on President Trump's corrupt solicitation of the government of Ukraine to interfere in the 2020 United States presidential election. As part of this impeachment inquiry, the committee's undertaking the investigation serves subpoenas seeking documents and testimony deemed vital to the inquiry from various executive branch agencies and offices and current and former officials. In response, without lawful cause or excuse, President Trump directed executive branch agencies, offices, and officials not to comply with those subpoenas. President Trump thus interposed the powers of the presidency against the lawful subpoenas of the House of Representatives and assumed to himself functions and judgments necessary to the exercise of the sole power of impeachment vested by the Constitution in the House of Representatives. President Trump abused the powers of his high office through the following means. 1, directing the White House to defy a lawful subpoena by withholding the production of documents sought therein by the committees. 2, directing other executive branch agencies and offices to defy lawful subpoenas and withhold the production of documents and records from the committees, in response to which the Department of State, Office of Management and Budget, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense refused to produce a single document or record. 3, directing current and former executive branch officials not to cooperate with the committees, in response to which 9 administration officials defied subpoenas for testimony, namely John Michael Mick Mulvaney, Robert B. Blair, John A. Eisenberg, Michael Ellis, Kristen Wells Griffith, Russell T. Vaught, Michael Duffy, Brian McCormick, and T. Ulrich Breckbull. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous efforts to undermine United States government investigations into foreign interference in United States elections. Through these actions, President Trump sought to arrogate to himself the right to determine the propriety, scope, and nature of an impeachment inquiry into his own conduct, as well as the unilateral prerogative to deny any and all information to the House of Representatives in the exercise of its sole power of impeachment. In the history of the Republic, no president has ever ordered the complete defiance of an impeachment inquiry or sought to obstruct and impede so comprehensively the ability of the House of Representatives to investigate high crimes and misdemeanors. This abuse of office served to cover up the president's own repeated misconduct and to seize and control the power of impeachment, and thus to nullify a vital constitutional safeguard vested solely in the House of Representatives. In all of this, President Trump has acted in a manner contrary to his trust as president and subversive of the constitutional government, to the great prejudice of the cause of law and justice, and to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
The question is on the second article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent, Donald John Trump, guilty or not guilty? The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Not guilty. Not guilty. Ms. Baldwin. Guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Guilty. Mrs. Blackburn. Not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. Guilty. Mr. Blunt. Not guilty. Mr. Booker. Guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Not guilty. Mr. Braun. Not guilty. Mr. Brown. Guilty. Mr. Burr. Not guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Guilty. Mrs. Capito. Not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Guilty. Mr. Carper. Guilty. Mr. Casey. Guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Not guilty. Ms. Collins. Not guilty. Mr. Coons. Guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Guilty. Mr. Cotton. Not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Not guilty. Mr. Daines. Not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Guilty. Mr. Durbin. Guilty. Mr. Enzi. Not guilty. Ms. Ernst. Not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Not guilty. Mr. Gardner. Not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Guilty. Mr. Graham. Not guilty. Mr. Grassley. Not guilty. Ms. Harris. Guilty. Ms. Hassan. Guilty. Mr. Hawley. Not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Guilty. Ms. Hirono. Guilty. Mr. Hoven. Not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Not guilty. Mr. Johnson.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Jones. Guilty. Mr. Kane. Guilty. Mr. Kennedy. Not guilty. Mr. King. Guilty. Ms. Klobuchar. Guilty. Mr. Langford. Not guilty. Mr. Leahy. Guilty. Mr. Lee.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mrs. Loeffler. Not guilty. Mr. Manchin. Guilty. Mr. Markey. Guilty. Mr. McConnell. Not guilty. Ms. McSally. Not guilty. Mr. Menendez. Guilty. Mr. Merkley. Guilty. Mr. Moran. Not guilty. Ms. Murkowski? Not guilty. Mr. Murphy? Guilty. Mrs. Murray? Guilty. Mr. Paul?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Perdue? Not guilty. Mr. Peters? Guilty. Mr. Portman? Not guilty. Mr. Reed? Guilty. Mr. Risch? Not guilty. Mr. Roberts? Not guilty. Mr. Romney? Not guilty. Ms. Rosen? Guilty. Mr. Rounds? Not guilty. Mr. Rubio? Not guilty. Mr. Sanders? Guilty. Mr. Sass? Not guilty. Mr. Schatz? Guilty. Mr. Schumer? Guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida? Not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen? Guilty. Mr. Shelby? Not guilty. Ms. Sinema? Guilty. Ms. Smith? Guilty. Ms. Stabenow? Guilty. Mr. Sullivan? Not guilty. Mr. Tester? Guilty. Mr. Thune? Not guilty. Mr. Tillis? Not guilty. Mr. Toomey? Not guilty. Mr. Udall? Guilty. Mr. Van Hollen? Guilty. Mr. Warner? Guilty. Ms. Warren? Guilty. Mr. Whitehouse? Guilty. Mr. Wicker? Not guilty. Mr. Wyden? Guilty. Mr. Young? Not guilty.
On this article of impeachment, 47 senators have pronounced Donald John Trump, President of the United States, guilty as charged. 53 senators have pronounced him not guilty as charged. 2/3 of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that respondent Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the second article of impeachment. The presiding officer directs judgment to be entered in accordance with the judgment of the Senate as follows. The Senate, having tried Donald John Trump, President of the United States, upon 2 articles of impeachment exhibited against him by the House of Representatives, and 2/3 of the senators present not having found him guilty of the charges contained therein, it is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby, acquitted of the charges in said articles.
Mr. Chief Justice,
The Majority Leader is recognized.
I send an order to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Ordered that the Secretary be directed to communicate to the Secretary of State as provided by Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials, and also to the House of Representatives, the judgment of the Senate in the case of Donald John Trump, and transmit a certified copy of the judgment to each.
Without objection, the order will be entered.
Mr. Chief Justice,
The Majority Leader is recognized.
before this process fully concludes, I want to very quickly acknowledge a few of the people who helped the Senate fulfill our duty these past weeks. First and foremost, I know my colleagues join me in thanking Chief Justice Roberts for presiding over the Senate trial with a clear head, steady hand, and the forbearance that this rare occasion demands. We know full well that his presence as our presiding officer came in addition to, not instead of, his day job across the street. So the Senate thanks the Chief Justice and his staff who helped him perform this unique role. Like his predecessor, Chief Justice Rehnquist, the Senate will be awarding Chief Justice Roberts the Golden Gavel. To commemorate his time presiding over this body, we typically award this to new senators after about 100 hours in the chair, but I think we can agree the Chief Justice has put in his due and then some. The page is delivering the gavel.
Thank you very much.
Of course, there are countless Senate professionals whose efforts were essential. I'll have more thorough thanks to offer next week to all of those teams, from the Secretary of the Senate's office to the parliamentarians, to the Sergeant at Arms team, and beyond. But there are two more groups I'd like to single out now. First, the two different classes of Senate pages who participated in this trial. Their footwork and cool under pressure literally kept the floor running. Our current class came on board right in the middle of the third presidential impeachment trial in American history and quickly found themselves hand-delivering 180 question cards from senators' desks to the dais. No pressure, right, guys? So thank you all very much for your good work. And second, the fine men and women of the Capitol Police. We know that the safety of our democracy literally rests in their hands every single day, but the heightened measures surrounding the trial meant even more hours and even more work and even more vigilance. Thank you all very much for your service to this body and to the country.
The chair recognizes the Democratic leader.
I join the Republican leader in thanking the personnel who aided the Senate over the past several weeks. Capitol Police do an outstanding job day in, day out to protect the members of this chamber, their staffs, the press, and everyone who works in and visits this Capitol. They were asked to work extra shifts and in greater numbers to provide additional security over the past 3 weeks. Thank you to every one of them. I, too, would like to thank those wonderful pages. I so much enjoyed you with your serious faces walking down right here and giving the Chief Justice our questions. As the leader noted, the new class of pages started midway in this impeachment trial. When you take a new job, you're usually given a few days to take stock of things, get up to speed. This class was given no such leeway, but they stepped right in, didn't miss a beat, ferrying hundreds of questions from U.S. senators to the Chief Justice on national television is not how most of us spend our first week at work, but they did it with aplomb. I'd also like to extend my personal thank you to David Houck, the Director of the Office of Accessibility Services, Tyler Pumphrey, the Supervisor, and Grace Ridgway, the wonderful Director of Capitol Facilities. Everyone Grace's team worked so hard to make sure we were ready for impeachment. Gary Richardson, known affectionately to us as Tiny, the chief chamber attendant. Jim Hoover and the cabinet shop, who built new cabinets to deprive us of the use of our electronics and flip phones during the trial. Brenda Bird and her team did a spectacular job of keeping the Capitol clean, and Lyden Webb and his team who moved the furniture and then moved it again and again and again. Grace, we appreciate all your hard work. Please convey our sincerest thanks to your staff. Thank you all, the whole staff, for your diligent work through many long days and late nights during this very trying time in our nation's history.
Mr. Chief Justice.
The chair also wishes to make a very brief statement. I would like to begin by thanking the Majority Leader and the Democratic Leader for their support as I attempted to carry out ill-defined responsibilities in an unfamiliar setting. They ensured that I had the wise counsel of the Senate itself through its secretary and her legislative staff. I am especially grateful to the parliamentarian and her deputy for their unfailing patience and keen insight. I am likewise grateful to the Sergeant-at-Arms and his staff for the assistance and many courtesies that they extended during my period of required residency. And thank you all for making my presence here as comfortable as possible. As I depart the chamber, I do so with an invitation to visit the court. By long tradition and in memory of the 135 years we sat in this building, we keep the front row of the gallery in our courtroom open for members of Congress who might want to drop by to see an argument or to escape one. I also depart with sincere good wishes as we carry out our common commitment to the Constitution through the distinct roles assigned to us by that charter. You have been generous hosts, and I look forward to seeing you again under happier circumstances. The chair recognizes the Majority Leader.
I move that the Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment on the articles against Donald John Trump, adjourn, sine die.
Without objection, the motion is agreed to. The Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment, stands adjourned, sine die.
The presiding officer. The Deputy Sergeant-at-Arms will escort the House managers out of the Senate chamber.
President.
The Majority Leader.
I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Some of you are probably wondering what's left to be said after listening to all this for the last 2 or 3 weeks. As you know, I'm occasionally rather parsimonious with my comments, and I thought it best to wait until this was behind us before having a more open discussion with all of you about what we've just witnessed. Let me start by saying I don't think any of you doubt that this was the most partisan of exercises. We all fully remember, and it's been said numerous times, the Speaker said roughly a year ago, you shouldn't go forward with an impeachment that was not bipartisan. I've watched her very carefully over the years. Our leadership positions have overlapped, and even before then, we were working together on appropriation bills back in the early days. I'm pretty sure she didn't want to do this. But the fact that she was pulled into this direction against what appeared to be her political instincts a year ago underscores that this was a purely political exercise. Now, having been dragged into something she instinctively felt was a mistake, then the second impulse was, let's get this over with as quickly as possible. Get it out of here, get it over in the other body, and let them deal with it. So that's why you had an abbreviated, truncated rush job over in the House. But even during that abbreviated period, it was pretty clear that they amassed a significant body of evidence from witnesses, which you heard them argue about over here frequently. They provided with us in the House record testimony from 13 witnesses, depositions from 17 witnesses. Then, of course, we added on top of that 180 questions. That we witnessed 193 witness video clips and 28,000 pages of evidence. So I asked my staff to count up the number of times we heard from the House managers during their presentation, how many times it was already proven. There were 60 times, 60, in which House managers said during their presentation to us that the case was either proven or proved, 60 times. There were 33 more times when one or more of the House managers said the evidence was overwhelming. So where did the nonsense about witnesses come from? I have a pretty good idea. After this thoroughly political exercise left the House and came over to the Senate, there was a lot of poll data taken. How are we going to sell this to senators? How are we going to sell it to the American people? Even though we already have all of this testimony and all of these witnesses, what polls well? Why, of course, if you ask the average citizen whether they think there ought to be witnesses in a trial, you're going to get an answer that you want. So the Speaker, I gathered, decided to sit on the impeachment papers after arguing that this is a matter of great urgency and the president needed to be removed from office as soon as possible. Sit on them for a month to laughably think that that somehow gave me leverage to concede their principal political argument, which was this was all about witnesses over here on our side. Well, that brought one of those rare smiles to my face, which you witnessed, in which I was perplexed by the strategy that was being employed. Finally, when it became obvious to everyone, it was an absurd position. Democratic senators were saying, why don't you send the papers over some of our own members were saying it before they got slapped back into line, the papers came over, and we knew full well this was all going to be about witnesses. I had said to my colleagues back in December in anticipation of the impeachment that their strategy would be to get it out of the House quickly and to leave it in the Senate endlessly, so that we'd have that wrapped around our axle indefinitely. And my suspicion was that it wasn't so much about President Trump, but rather about taking the Senate. And my counterpart, Senator Schumer, finally in the last few weeks pretty much admitted it to all of you that that's what this was all about. It was about taking the Senate and about trying to bog us down in this and to try to get my guys to have a lot of tough votes. So I'm proud of my colleagues for seeing through that, for knowing that even though if you ask a typical voter, should there be witnesses in a trial, they'd say, sure, of course there ought to be witnesses. That it was really about, not the president, we all knew he was not going to be removed from office, but about trying to take the Senate. And so I'm proud of my members for resisting the temptation to go down that path, for also preventing what the second strategy was. It was pretty clear the Democrats, if they couldn't win this, wanted to embarrass the Chief Justice, try to drag him into this maelstrom. And the way that could have been done, obviously, was with a 50-50 vote where he would have been accused had he chosen not to rule, which, of course, I can't imagine he would have, but it's pretty clear that would have dragged the Supreme Court right into the middle of the maelstrom as well. So we've reached the conclusion. I think this was a thoroughly political exercise from the beginning to the end. And the final irony of it all is the Speaker was right in the beginning. Because here we are today in a position to judge the political impact of this. Since it all started about politics, how did it end about politics? The President has his highest approval rating since he's been in office. I can tell you as a poll watcher who's looking at polls and certain Senate races, every one of our people in tough races, every one of them, is in better shape today than they were before the impeachment trial started. So I'm not sitting here predicting what will be the biggest issue in November, but I can tell you this. Right now, this is a political loser for them. They initiated it. They thought this was a great idea. And at least for the short term, it has been a colossal political mistake. Manu?
Several of your members have been critical of the president's conduct, saying it was inappropriate, shameful, as Lisa McCarthy said. One of them, of course, today said he would vote to convict the president on abuse of power. Mitt Romney did. And for you, why is it okay for the president to ask another foreign country to investigate a political rival?
Now, Manu, I've been responding to you for years. And you know that what I'm here to talk about today is the political impact of this. We've completed it. We've listened to the arguments. We've voted. It's in the rearview mirror. And I think what's appropriate now is to weigh, since it all began for political reason, the political impact of it. And I think it's pretty clear what I've already said is where we are right now. Yeah.
Is there room in the Republican Party for someone who votes for the president's conviction?
Well, I was surprised and disappointed, but I still think that we had a great teamwork on this, and I think we're in a good position going into our Senate races and the presidential race with regard to this issue. There may be plenty of other issues between now and November, but I think we're in pretty good shape right now. Yeah.
Leader McConnell, some of Speaker Pelosi's top lieutenants are already talking about next steps, subpoenaing John Bolton. Is there a serious political price to pay if they don't move on after impeachment?
Well, you know, I've watched these impeachments over these investigations over the years by both sides. I really think the American people are more likely to focus at this point and for the rest of the year on what kind of shape is the country in? How are you feeling about things? Are you better off, as President Reagan put it, Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Yeah, I think the investigations will go on. That's sort of what Congress does. We've done it when we were in the majority and there was a Democratic president. They've done it. I wouldn't expect that to stop. I think in the end, it's not likely to have much of an impact on any of the races, the presidential or the Senate races. Yeah.
Donald Trump Jr., just to follow up on Eric's question there, is calling for Mitt Romney to be expelled from the Republican conference. Is there any chance that Mitt Romney is expelled from the Republican conference as a result of his vote to convict?
Yeah, look, I was surprised and disappointed, but we have much work to do for the American people. And I think Senator Romney has been largely supportive of most everything we've tried to accomplish. Yeah.
Why is there this reluctance to engage specifically on the issue of the president's conduct? Was it acceptable for President Trump to ask the leader of Ukraine to investigate the Bidens and subsequently hold up military aid? That specific question.
I'm sure you were paying close attention, but that's exactly what we've been talking about for the last 3 weeks. Yeah.
Obviously, you and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer had a lot of disagreement about how the trial should go. And how would you characterize your relationship with the minority leader coming out of this, and has it been strained?
Yeah, I think the relationship is fine, but adopting the Clinton rules didn't serve his purpose. So let's go back to what he was trying to achieve. He was very forthright about it. We had a discussion before we began the trial. He wanted to guarantee at least some number of witnesses before we started. I felt that our best interest and the best interest of the country was served by listening to the arguments and going through the questioning period before we got to the question of witnesses, because we might or might not conclude at that point that we needed any witnesses because we had a mountain of evidence headed our way that they referred to repeatedly, which was the best argument against additional witnesses. I mean, how many times did they have to say the case was conclusive? What was the line? Proven, or proved, or overwhelming. Now, when you listen to those kind of arguments being made by the managers, you scratch your head and say, now really? Do we need to hear more? So that was the difference. We weren't angry about it. He was trying to achieve an outcome that he thought helped him win the Senate. I felt the Clinton precedent made more sense, not only for the country, but for us. Yeah, David?
Can you talk a little bit more about why it was so important to you, not just to make sure the president was acquitted, but that you had a united conference, which you almost had, voting to acquit the president, and how fear of the Republican base for your members that are in some tough states may have helped make that decision?
Well, first, I obviously hoped that the result in the Senate would be similar or exactly the same as the results in the House. And I think the message there is don't do partisan impeachments, which, remember, is what the Speaker said, and she was initially correct about it, what she said sometime back. We don't want this to become routine. All of us looked at a number of things the founders said when they put impeachment in the Constitution. And they really were concerned about it becoming a kind of routine effort based on policy differences or personality differences. Sound familiar? I mean, the main thing that drove Andrew Johnson's impeachment was they just didn't like him. Sound familiar? I mean, that's the kind of thing, it seems to me, the founders did not want to happen, that we'd get into a routine of doing this all the time because we had a policy difference or a personality difference. So I'm glad it ended the way it did. I hope the message to the House of Representatives, don't do this again. Yeah.
How long is Senator Romney going to be in the doghouse?
We don't have any doghouses here. The most important vote is the next vote. Cheryl.
Can you talk a little bit about what is on the Senate's agenda going forward? And given the obvious animosity between the Speaker and the President at last night's State of the Union speech, do you think that this Congress can really accomplish anything legislatively with this White House?
My biggest problem is accomplishing it with this House of Representatives. As you all know, we were pretty different approaches to America's problems between the House and the Senate. I think we've got a chance to do some more business. I certainly hope so. We're looking at infrastructure, we're looking at a parks bill, we're looking at land and water conservation. There are, even in the midst of the election, some things that I think we can do together. And even though several of you have completely bought into the notion that we're somehow totally dysfunctional, I would point you back to the end of last year. There were a number of dramatic bipartisan accomplishments in the overall spending bills at the end of the year. Admittedly, they didn't move across the floor independently, but in that bill were a huge number of priorities for both sides. And those only get negotiated on a bipartisan basis. So I don't buy the notion that the Congress is dysfunctional. We have some big differences. I mean, look at what the House passes and look at what we do. We do have some big differences. But we'll get some more work done for the American people on the things that we can agree on. And then they'll settle all of this in November and decide who they want to lead the country going forward. Yeah, back in the back.
Senators Collins and Murkowski have a resolution to extend the deadline to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
The Equal Rights Amendment resolution from Senators Murkowski and Collins to ratify that constitutional amendment, is that something you'd be open to putting on the floor?
To ratify what?
The Equal Rights Amendment.
Oh, I haven't thought about that. I'm personally not a supporter, but I haven't thought about it. Yeah.
Will the Republican go after the Biden after the impeachment? Will the Republican Party go after the Biden after the impeachment?
Will we do what about impeachment?
Go after the Bidens.
Look, I don't tell the committee chairman what to look at. One of you suggested earlier the House is probably still in investigatory business. I can only suggest that the Senate could choose to do that as well, but we don't have a dictatorship over in the Senate, and I don't instruct the committee chairman as to what to take a look at. Yeah.
So you have avoided answering the question that Manu asked several times, including twice today.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to make it the third time?
Well, you just praised your members for taking difficult votes in a political environment. It's a perfectly reasonable question to ask whether or not the president's actions were appropriate.
Yeah, I think that's what we've just dealt with for 3 weeks. 3 weeks. We've listened, we've voted, we've had a number of internal meetings to discuss all of this, which you all ended up knowing a good deal about and writing about. It's time to move on. This decision has been made. As far as I'm concerned, it's in the rearview mirror, and the consequences of it in terms of the future are up to the voters of the country to decide who they want to lead the government for the next 4, and in our case, with the class, 6 years. I'm going to take one more if there is one. Yeah.
What do you make of the fact that the House vote was bipartisan against the impeachment, and in the Senate you had the opposite, with Senator Romney being the only GOP?
Yeah, I think you can. I think they're pretty clearly party line both ways. I think that's what you can take out of it. Pretty much party line in both chambers. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Check, check, check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Our shooters are here. Yeah. Get off here real quick, Bob.
Okay. Anything pops up.
Oh, they get the audio.
Hey man, did you turn that bulletin off? Is that okay?
His audio. My question. That's Mike. The video's here. You would ask me. Sorry about that.
Bulletin that you wish you always leave that on. What? Do you think I'm gonna do something for you guys?
I always turn it off.
I'll turn it off.
Oh, sorry. I just turned it on. Yeah, I just turned it on.
They have an issue.
Are we close?
Yeah. You guys heads up. Heads up. Sorry. Come on. What about the other?
Good afternoon, everybody. This is clearly not a happy day for the nation or the Senate. The Senate turned its back on the truth, on a fair trial, on doing what the Founding Fathers would have wanted us to do. But Democrats walked out of the Senate chamber with their heads held high because we sought the truth. We did everything we could to get the truth. The American people believed that and knew we were fighting for the truth, and know it to this day. I'm very proud of my caucus. Every member voted his or her conscience. Every member cared about the fundamental here, what I tried to talk about in my speech, the truth, the facts. It was a day, a week, 2 weeks, where the crucible of the nation was tested. A lot of people, including a Republican, passed the test. A lot of Republicans, Leader McConnell, failed that test. Failed to live up what this country is all about. Failed to live up to getting the truth. Early in the process, we defined what a fair trial was. Witnesses, documents. We didn't know what the witnesses would say. We didn't try to have a long list of witnesses to be dilatory. We simply looked at the ones who were eyewitness to the account and what they would say. And now that our Republican colleagues have rejected a fair trial, truth, there's a giant asterisk next to the president's acquittal. The asterisk says he was acquitted without facts, he was acquitted without a fair trial, and it means that his acquittal is virtually valueless. So while Leader McConnell in the White House may be cheering this as a win, history will view this as a Pyrrhic victory for Senate Republicans and the Senate Republican Party, and the Republican Party, and for President Trump. Because there was a metaphor here. McConnell and I were each supposed to speak, me at 3:30, him at 3:45. While I was speaking, only 2 Republicans were in the chamber. They were hiding in the cloakroom. When McConnell spoke, they all came out. That's a metaphor. They were afraid to hear the other side. They were afraid to hear the truth. They were afraid to talk about what was right. Our members all sat and listened to McConnell, and what he said didn't really bother us. For one thing, he didn't address a single charge in the 2 articles of impeachment. All he could do was attack this, attack that, attack Democrats, attack the House. This is a sacred trial. Talk about the facts. But they couldn't. And I believe the American people will realize that this was one of the largest cover-ups in the history of our nation. I believe the American people will know who stood in the way of truth, who were afraid of the facts, who covered up. And make no mistake about it, the drip, drip, drip of evidence is going to keep coming out. With each new revelation, Republicans are going to have to answer for their votes. They chose to turn their back on the American people and stand for a cover-up. They chose to use ad hominem attacks and finger-pointing. Leader McConnell couldn't even bring himself to say what the president did was wrong when you asked him a few minutes ago. That's astounding. Maybe he believes what Dershowitz believes. This president can do anything he wants. So, as I said, we always knew it was an uphill fight. No one had illusions that the president would be convicted. But we made the fight for truth, and we made the fight for facts, and it created a bipartisan impeachment that can never be erased from history. Never. And by the way, the chart McConnell had was as deceptive as most of his arguments. How many of those witnesses were allowed by President Trump on that chart? 0. How many documents were allowed by President Trump in the impeachment trial? 0. He criticized the House, but he's claiming credit for their witnesses, which weren't all the witnesses they wanted. So I'll take some questions. Yes, Garrett.
How important will it be politically and historically that this was a bipartisan vote? And what was your reaction when you found out it was going to be?
First, I do want to salute Mitt Romney. The pressure on every Republican was enormous. Every Republican knows that this president is vindictive, vengeful, vicious sometimes, and they don't want to oppose him. There are a whole lot of Republicans, I believe, who knew we were right, but said, I don't want the bother of being attacked relentlessly by the president and the hard right. And so the fact that this is bipartisan holds up a beacon as to what was right and what was wrong. And the fact that the Democrats were united in conviction of the president, and even more important, on witnesses and on documents, speaks legions. Yes. Go ahead.
Senator Schumer, can you speak a little bit? Senator McConnell is making the argument that the polling numbers actually look better for his Republican incumbents than they do.
The amazing thing about Leader McConnell is he says the House is being political, and all he does is talk politics. The bottom line is, if you believe that truth prevails, if you believe that the American people wanted the facts, we're happy to live with that verdict and see where it takes us. Plain and simple. Yes, Manu.
President Trump's approval rating is now 49% according to the Gallup poll. Are you concerned at all that this effort was a political gift to the president?
No, not at all. This was seeking the truth. History, if you believe that right prevails, and we know we were right, and we know they knew they were wrong, as evidenced by them sort of hiding, shaking in the cloakroom, and even being unwilling to listen to the other side, then you know that it's going to work out. And I believe it will work out. Poll numbers go up and down, up and down. That's not what motivated us here. In something as serious as this, you try to figure out what is the right thing to do What is the truth? How do you get the truth? And you go forward. And the chips will fall where they may. But almost always, if American history is any indication, when you're right, the chips fall on your side. Go ahead, Cheryl. No, I learned of the vote just before they called the roll when someone told me he put out a statement. Joe Manchin wrestled with this and struggled with it, showed far more courage than every Republican other than Mitt Romney. And I didn't know where he'd come out. I told him that he should just wrestle with his conscience. He's a religious man with God, and come to the conclusion to do the right thing. And I told him we'd be friends no matter what. No. You always shout out. I'll get to you, but I want to get to people who I try to go to the milder-mannered people occasionally. That'll be up to them. I'm not going to get into that.
Do you think that if they do, what should happen?
I'm not going to comment on what the House of Representatives should do. As I said, I thought they did a very fine job. I don't have any second guessing of them. And the irony is they did a far finer job than the Senate did under Mitch McConnell's leadership. Mitch McConnell covered it all up. The House didn't. Nope. Yes, back there. Look, this idea we have too many impeachments, too few impeachments. The standard should not be how many or what's politically right or wrong. The standard should be, did the president commit high crimes and misdemeanors? I think it's conclusive that the president did. And if the president does it in 3 months, they should impeach him again. And if the next president does it, they should impeach him or her. The bottom line is very simple. This idea that the election should decide, if the Founding Fathers thought elections should decide, they wouldn't have put impeachment in the Constitution. They obviously said there are some instances where impeachment should decide. And there was no term limits then. So it's not that, second term is okay and all of that. It's the most ridiculous argument that elections should decide when the Founding Fathers put impeachment in the Constitution. Yes?
Ukraine was the prime victim of this trial.
Yes.
Do you feel that Ukraine can become a toxic issue in legislation?
Well,
what would be the signs of support?
Well, I hope. We should be supporting Ukraine. There has been bipartisan support for Ukraine in past, very strong votes for aid for Ukraine. But what happens is when the president comes up with this crazy conspiracy theory that came out of someone's mind and originally came out of Russian intelligence, all the Republicans say, yeah, that must be true. The obeisance to the president, when so many people know he's wrong, when so many people know he's mistruthful, is very damaging to the Republic. Okay? You should not be afraid to tell a president he is wrong when you know he is. But Donald Trump has them all very fearful, very fearful. Yes? You. Hallelujah, you finally got called on.
So Speaker Pelosi has been criticized by some Republicans for ripping up President Trump's State of the Union speech. Do you believe that was the appropriate?
I think the greater criticism was the partisan nature of this speech, was the fact that it was untruthful in so many places. When the worst thing about this was the president made this a campaign rally, a reality TV show. He even sounded like a carnival barker. It was so demeaning for the presidency for this speech. That's what I'm aghast at. Yes.
Mr. Schumer, you made reference to Senator Manchin. Do you worry about your members from red or purple states who now own these votes to convict?
I said truth will out. And I think those members who voted for truth, who voted for witnesses and documents, as the American people were for, will be rewarded for it. Nope, not you. You.
There's been a number of the president's allies who have now come out saying that Mitt Romney should be expelled from the Republican conference. What do you think that says about the Republican Party generally?
Plenty.
Well,
it makes my case. If you stand up when you think the president's wrong, and by the way, the vast majority of Americans and a good chunk of Republicans said the president's wrong. They may have come to a different conclusion, but they said he's wrong, and they want to throw you out of the party. That's why the percentage of Americans who are Republican is less today than when Donald Trump took office. Yes. Yep. I didn't call you, but I'll do you, and then I'll do her. Okay. You know, you're all asking these political questions. Go ask Mitch McConnell. He's interested in the politics in this. We're interested in finding out the right thing, the truth. Okay? Yes.
Senator Lisa Murkowski said that the Senate had basically hit bottom with its partisanship. Do you agree? And if you agree, how do you expect the Senate to
Well, I'm not going to tell you what she said, but I went to Murkowski last night, and I told her, because she said no one could come to an agreement. I said I went to McConnell 3 times before I sent the letter that asked for witnesses and documents and said, let's negotiate a bipartisan agreement, and he was not interested. Then after I sent the letter, I met with McConnell. I said, let's negotiate. He said, not if you have any witnesses or documents. He was unwilling to negotiate. That's what created the rift. We were willing to sit down and talk. Yes?
Related to the risk that you're talking about, earlier Leader McConnell said that despite these partisan divides that have occurred and despite the fact that it is an election year, he does still think that there are things that Congress can get done together. Do you agree with that?
Well, I'd always want to try, but it's laughable. This is Leader McConnell. I think Dick Durbin mentions it. We've had 27 amendments on the floor, 6 of which were forced by Rand Paul. Leader McConnell has day after day, week after week, month after month refused to put things on the floor to debate. It was laughable that he said impeachment's getting in the way of getting things done. The only thing he's getting done is trying to put all of these right-wing judges on the floor that can pass with 50 votes. So it's laughable that they say they want to get things done, but we're always welcome. If he wants to sit down and try to bring things to the floor and allow amendments, hallelujah. We wait the day. Yeah, did you get one yet? No, I'm not doing it. Go ahead, you. Yeah.
Can you talk, do you have any advice for your caucus about taking the high road, moving on?
We did take the high road. We're proud of it. As I said, I think we walk with our heads held high. I think the Republican caucus is ashamed, many of them, of what they did.
And following up on that, you mentioned that Republicans were afraid of hearing the truth, afraid of hearing the other side. What do you think they have to be afraid of now?
They're always afraid of Donald Trump. They're always afraid of Donald Trump. He brooks no dissension. And they look back to last year when the 2 senators who had the courage to oppose him, Senator Flake, a conservative, and Senator Corker, a more mainstream Republican, he hounded them out of the party. Thank you, everybody.